Hi, I'm Jo, and I'm here today with Aleph Contemporary. We've come to interview Willard Boepple, who's a brilliant sculptor, artist and printmaker, and I can't wait to hear what he's got to tell us. So Willard, you were at art school in the US in the 1960s. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
I grew up in Berkeley, California, which had then became, just when I started school, quite a hotbed of student rebellion, shall we say. The politics sort of took over a lot of the time for me. I was focused on being a painter at the time, and starting in high school, in fact before, I painted at home a lot, and it was, I had a little studio in the basement. It was a central part of my life. And the school itself, I thought, with the arrogance of a 17-year-old, who knows everything, of course, that art making wasn't something you could be taught. You had to learn it. I guess I really, looking back, I guess I really was sort of endorsing and following the apprenticeship model. So in school, the first couple of years at Berkeley, I took general studies. I was studying liberal arts. But in the education, in my art education, I think the big start was the Skowhegan School of Painting. It's really a summer art school. It was started by a group of artists in the 50s and is a quite remarkable place. It is run and operated by artists, and they come and go in a fairly loose structure of 50 or 60 young artist residents, of which I was one. And that was I think a 9-week, about 9 weeks, and was terrific. Alex Katz and a lot of artists that were very active in those days were right down on the ground with us, and there were big critiques weekly, often leading to shouting matches, which were, it was a great time of discovery, and that was really the beginning of my art education.
Who were your artistic heroes at that time at art school and afterwards?
Well, in Berkeley, I had the good fortune of getting to know Richard Diebenkorn, who was very supportive. And so, I mean, even when I first was at 15 and 14 doing things in the basement, he would always ask, when he was a family friend, a neighbor, and when he and his wife Phyllis would come for dinner, he'd always say, could I come look? And my Lord, he always went after the accidents and the screw-ups and the things that I was trying to hide, and pulled them out as things to learn from. So fast forward a year at Rhode Island School of Design, I moved east. I went to City College in New York, where I actually wound up getting a degree finally, and had a wonderful education. I mean, City College was, at that time, it's a very big school and draws on all of New York for its talent. And so there were wonderful poets and painters and sculptors who came through and I worked with. And then when I graduated, I moved to Vermont, where I had been born, actually, and my father still lived, and set up a studio, and with the intention of spending some time with my father and sort of reconnecting, and intending to move back to New York and sort of begin my way. Mm-hmm. And the summer I was sort of preparing to make that move, a sculptor who taught at Bennington College called Isaac Witkin said, "Oh, Willie, why don't you stay here for the summer and work for me, and then follow your muse." I went to work for Isaac, and the first day I knew I'd found my home. It was the physicality of the material that just opened a door for me that I've never, regretted. I got very interested in a group of English sculptors who were sort of at the front edge of what I thought sculpture could be. They had been, many of them, students of Anthony Caro. They were then at that time called the New Generation. I think that's still a term.
We still use that term, yeah, the New Generation, absolutely. Yeah.
So I flew to London and called them all up on the phone.
Did you?
Yeah, Bill Tucker, Tim Scott, David Annesley, Michael Bolus. There were more, I'm forgetting. And they all, Philip King, oh yeah. And they all, I just said, I'm, a young sculptor from New York, and I'd love to buy you a beer, and just, and they were all welcoming and very, I early on went to Stockwell Depot, where some of them were working at the time. So that was an eye-opener, and it really, ever since London, I've felt, I considered myself sculptural home.
Because it's really important not to overstress how exciting sculpture was at that time, wasn't it, with the New Generation, and as you said, those possibilities with material and what you did with sculpture. It must have been dazzling for you.
Well, it was, and color. Color and sculpture was, they were all at the forefront, Caro amongst them. I mean, probably leader of the pack in many ways. But boy, and imagery and sort of form-making invention. I mean, you consider Henry Moore was the foundation for that group in many ways. Or certainly the very best example of their foundation. What they were doing was brand new, and yes, very exciting. Much as the art world sort of center at the time, the energy seemed to be in the U.S., in New York. In sculpture, it was in London, in my book. They were answering a lot of the issues going on in minimal art that were alive in New York and in the U.S., particularly in sculpture. And a lot of the New Generation sort of aesthetic and drive was a response to minimal art.
I absolutely agree with you. I think the sculptors in London at that time were really leading the way, weren't they, internationally, about what sculpture was.
Could be.
And what it could be.
Yeah,
exactly.
what it could be.
And then since then, you've divided your time between the US and England?
Yeah. I back home in the US, I got teaching jobs. I taught at Bennington for a year, an assistantship, and then got a wonderful post at the Boston Museum School. Place I loved teaching, and I really built a department there it was great fun. I had lots of flexibility, and it was a place to grow. So back and forth. I then had the very good fortune of marrying a British woman.
Lucky
so
you.
We had double reasons to come. And we moved here thinking we'd be here for 6 months or a year, and it ended up being 4. And that's when I started making prints. And I didn't have a full-fledged sculpture studio because I didn't think we were going to, I kept thinking we were about to leave. But I did find ways of working with other artists in their studios, and worked with a resin sculptor, a resin caster, making some resin sculptures. And then some prints. And then my good painter friend, my friend Pete Griffin, introduced me to Kip Gresham, who he came to an opening I had in London, and we met, and he said, "You should come out and work with me." And I said, "Oh my God, I know nothing about prints, Kip. I'd need some startup training." He said, "Oh, nonsense. I love working with sculptors. You're not afraid of materials, and you just come." So I did.
It's quite a technical process, isn't it? Particularly the idea of a monoprint. Can you explain about the process?
Okay, well they're actually quite simple ones. Each one is composed of 3 shapes. So each of those were drawn, and then those shapes laid into the screen and connected in the way that the drawing dictates. And that's the kit part. That's what he is a wizard at, is doing the layout and registering the shapes so that they fit just so. Then you begin squeegeeing the color through each of the shapes and proceeding. So we would begin very light in each shape until we get all 3 established, and then start building the color and building it by layering these thin. Though in the case of these, probably each shape got maybe 10 passes of color. An awful lot of printmaking consists of coming up with a single image which may be graven and etched or something like that, and then boom, 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 just repeated.
Because the key to these is that they're unique.
They're all unique. They're all, and one informs the other. Oh, let's try a little more red here and see what happens, or put some black in, or so it's alive, and it's more like making a painting.
And how has your work in making these prints informed your sculpture, if it has?
Oh, it's a good question that I ask myself. I don't know. I just know that when I've gotten through a group of pieces, I might turn my head and see a sculpture in the corner and think, wow, they are brother and sister. There's something I'm after that's in them both. I don't begin with a notion of taking that print and building a sculpture from it. That's never worked out for me, or vice versa, really. And I think of it probably most commonly, most frequently, as some kind of gesture that expresses feeling, whether it be embrace or grip or push. I don't know, what does hope look like? A group of sculptures that actually came a little before these prints began from images from wrestling. Talk about grip and gesture and movement. You know, the arch of a back and the shoulder and elbow and all those kinds of movements. So on the wall in the studio at one point were, you know, a dozen shots of these sweaty bodies, you know, gripping and twisting and pushing. And back to other sources for sculpture. A lot of my work comes out of the world of physical objects that we build around us, the functional objects we live in, the stool, the chair, the door handle, all of them, as they all relate to the body. I mean, the proportions of a chair, the dimensions of a stepladder, the depth of a step, you know, the configuration of a gripped handle, all echo the body or are driven by the dimensions, space, and movement of the body. And a lot of my sculpture comes out of that. It's the familiar language of our built world. I mean, the height of the ceiling, the switch, the light switch, you know, the height of the door handle, all the proportions and measurements of our environment are all dedicated, devoted to the practicalities of physical reach and height. And so really our built world is a reflection of us, of our bodies. You know, when the windowsill is too high, it's wrong. And we feel that. It's visceral. It's
an unconscious language, isn't it?
It is. It's a felt language.
And that expresses itself in the prints as well that you're making.
Well, that's the territory I think about. You know, that's the territory.